Welcome to One Word Stories, episode 34. I'm really happy to welcome a very precious guest of mine, David Hutchens. He works with stories in the leadership context. He helps leaders not only to find their stories, but also to craft them and to bring them to the people. So I'm very, very happy to welcome you, David.
Thank you so much, Joanna. I have appreciated your work, and so I'm delighted to be a part of this.
I appreciate your work a lot. You have just published one more book after your nine muses right now, the Story Dash, when you share this exactly the story sprint idea. And of course, after this set of cards for how to work with stories for leaders. So very, very creative ideas. And I'm really, really looking forward to hear from you much, much more. First of all, how your journey actually start in this context of working with stories in the leadership context. And beforehand, even what do you actually mean by the word changing leadership?
What do I mean by the word leadership? Wow, way to start with the most difficult question possible. What is leadership? You know what? One of my favorite definitions of what is a leader is from the American business author Peter Senge. He wrote a best-selling book called The Fifth Discipline a few years back. And I love his definition of a leader. He says a leader is someone who has followers. That's it. I love that definition because of how simple it is. A leader is somebody with followers. I mean, that really kind of gets to it because, you know, it makes me ask myself, is anybody following me? Who's listening to me? Right. And so that's the first litmus test of a leader is somebody is paying attention to you. And then a leader points to the future and says, we're going this way. And the followers say, yes, we'll go with you. So that's leadership.
Great, great. I love it when someone can give a definition that reduces complexity and is close in one sentence.
Yeah, I tend to do that. Some people tell me I oversimplify. So
okay, oversimplification is always challenging in the intercultural context because, of course, people can interpret different stories into one sentence and even one word. And how did actually your journey with storytelling for leaders start?
So it's fine. We talk about the origin stories, right? Leaders have origin story. What's the thing that brought you here? And I have a few. I have quite a few that I could tell. So here's one. I started my career in advertising here in the United States. So I was a copywriter. I worked in big advertising agencies in Dallas, Texas, and then in Atlanta, Georgia. I used to make advertisements, and I got frustrated with that work because I was spending 60 hours a week writing about hamburgers and writing about credit cards and cellular service. And I knew I wanted to write about something else. You know, I knew I wanted to write about leadership and innovation and teams. So I quit my job at the ad agency so that I could write about these different things. And I actually tell my clients today, in my work in organizational learning, I still think of myself as an advertising guy. But instead of selling hamburgers, now I help ideas move through organizations. You know, I just referenced Peter Senge in the Fifth Discipline. In the 90s, when I was living in Atlanta, that's where Coca-Cola is headquartered. And I was doing some communications work with Coca-Cola, and they asked for help with a problem because they were on this journey to become what's known as a learning organization. That was the idea of Peter Senge in the Fifth Discipline: systems thinking and mental models and all of these disciplines. And they were moving this through the entire organization. You know, Coca-Cola is huge, and they were moving this through. And the problem they had was nobody at Coke understood what they were talking about. Nobody understood what is a learning organization, what is systems theory. Nobody understood it. And so they asked me for help to come up with a solution that would help them explain what a learning organization is. And so I wrote, oh, Joanna, it's the craziest thing. I wrote this silly story about a flock of sheep that outwits a pack of hungry wolves. And in the process, they display the capabilities of a learning organization. And then I had a friend who is an illustrator, a cartoonist, and I had him draw some crazy pictures of sheep and wolves. And I dropped it into the manuscript. And I called it Outlearning the Wolves.
Mm-hmm.
And then later, a publisher picked up this crazy story and it went all over the world. It's like in 12 different languages now. And it's still selling. People still buy this book. So I didn't know it was going to be a successful book. I was just trying to solve a problem for my client, which I think is where the best ideas come from, is solving a real problem, right? But the Outlearning the Wolves is the thing that made me stop and say, why did that work? Why was that successful in engaging so many different cultures and inviting people into this rich conversation around organizational learning? And that was really the moment of inquiry that began the inquiry into storytelling. And I thought, this is so interesting. I'm just going to explore this. So that's what I've been doing for the past 15, 20 years.
Yeah. So you have just also emphasized one more very important issue, that everybody needs the origin story. This is how the whole adventure with storytelling, story sharing, or also inspiring by stories starts. And in your newest book, you actually also give this idea for the story sprint, so to say, the story dash. And the very first step is actually story mining. So, it was so easy for you when I asked you the question, how did the adventure start and why you actually made it happen in this context, to work with stories in the leadership context. What is your experience? What does it require to really mine for stories, or so to say, to follow the first step?
The first thing you need is courage. And the reason I say that is, I work with a lot of technology companies, a lot of science-based organizations, very, very smart people who are doing very big projects, international projects. And to bring in this language that is story, story is a container for emotion, right? So now we're bringing emotion into the work. That's scary for a lot of leaders. Once we start telling stories, when I was telling you a story about myself, I kind of felt that a little bit. I realized I was like opening myself up and I was revealing who I am to you. And I've actually gotten used to doing this, but it's for a lot of people, that's a scary feeling. We're not used to doing that, especially in a leadership context where we want to be smart and we want to be accurate and we want to have a PowerPoint slide for everything that we say. To use this language that story requires some courage to overcome the personal fear of self-disclosure and vulnerability. Yeah.
However, this is exactly the moment when magic happens, because there is no story if there is no struggle. There is no story if the person doesn't share any moment of doubt or vulnerability. So this is actually part of the game.
It is magic when it happens. I love that you use that word. I was just thinking about, before COVID, I've done quite a bit of work in Germany, and I hope to come back so that you and I can share a coffee or a meal together. But I was with a technology firm in Munich right before COVID. And I remember I had all these German technology leaders. They were sitting in circles facing each other, just telling stories. And I remember I just kind of leaned back at the table and I just kind of soaked up the energy in the room. I could just feel good energy, and I could see people's faces. People's faces were relaxed and their postures were open, and they were sharing this emotional story content with each other. And it just, it felt like joy in
Hmm.
the room. And there's just so much pleasure in the room of seeing and hearing and connecting with one another. And I remember it just kind of filled my heart up. And you're right, Joanna, it's magic. And all it requires is that we use this language, that story that we already have, and just
Hmm.
bring it back into the workspace because it belongs there. And so that's the conversation I'm having with leaders these days.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yes, and this is also something you emphasize as well. And actually, you have also described it shortly in your book that once during such a meeting, you mentioned also this emotional part of sharing stories, and also that when we talk about organizations, we also need to address emotions, and that it felt kind of weird for the leaders gathered in the room. So do you think that, this, let's say, temptation to work with stories and also the acceptance for working with stories vary from culture to culture? Or is it something completely universal and you can work with every single leader this way?
So I think what's similar is far greater than what's different in terms of cultures, because I've done this work in, let's see, in India,
Mhm.
in Germany, France, South Africa, uh, Tokyo, Singapore. I've never been to Australia. I still haven't been to Australia. And so I've done this in lots and lots of different cultures, and it's the same. It doesn't change. What I do see that's different is different cultures have different comfort with emotion,
Yeah.
especially in the workplace.
Mm.
Everybody struggles with it. You know,
Mhm.
my European leaders think Americans are really good at being emotional in the workspace. Even my American leaders struggle with emotion, but I do think that European leaders struggle with it more. You know, there's a stronger feeling that emotion doesn't belong here in a professional space, which
I
is completely
guess, yeah.
false, because
Mhm.
organizations are people systems, and that means they are emotional systems. There's emotion already in the room. So if we're not addressing it or speaking to it, then we're missing a huge point of leverage for influence and leadership. I'm sorry I interrupted you.
No, no, I jumped in. And the reason was that actually, it's also a little bit of generalizations that also within Europe, you have different tendencies, so to say. Yes, when I think of people in Middle Eastern Europe and also maybe in, let's say,
Right.
German speaking Europe, and then also the South with lots of temperament and also showing emotions. I know that it's pretty tricky to, put people into these drawers. However, this cultural worlds of obviousness also have an impact on showing emotions in the leadership context, I guess. I just wanted to add it shortly to, yeah, to this stuff that even though working with stories is universal, as you say, and this is exactly my experience, because whenever I was sharing also, some activities, practices, how to work with stories in different contexts across cultures, it was also my learning that, people just need the invitations, they just need the space. And the other point is, of course, this emotional stuff, that you cannot await from everybody in the room, if there is a crowd of people from different corners, that they start telling stories with the same level of passion, so to say, and the same world of obviousness, that it's so clear for them as leaders.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. No, I've experienced that as well. And I appreciate what you're saying about culture. Yeah. Culture is a real thing. And then there are individuals who, when you try to map the culture onto an individual person, that feels dehumanizing,
Yeah,
right? Uh,
exactly.
because I mean, uh, there's some French leaders I work with who are the most loving, caring, open leaders that I know. And there's some American leaders I work with who don't match the emotional American stereotype and who are very stoic, right? So we're all people. We're not embodiments of the culture.
Exactly, exactly. And we have many, many cultural influences. Yeah.
Recently with one of my colleagues, since we train people in, to be facilitators of story work, we started creating a competency model of what it requires to be a story facilitator. And one of the top items on the competency model is epistemological humility. It's a term I got from my friend Paul Costello. The ability to sit and be present with somebody who has experiences and beliefs that are alien to yours. And in this work, in story work, sometimes you're going to hear content that you don't like. You're going to hear things that make you mad. And then how will you be as a facilitator, as a leader, as a story listener? How will you be present? And this is where this humility comes in, to simply receive the person's story and to be mindful of the assumptions and the mental models that I'm bringing to it, and setting those aside so that I can simply receive this person in their full humanness. That's an essential skill in this work.
Yes, definitely. Definitely, yes. And I'm really grateful for your comment, very mindful comment, because this is actually something that is kind of, this taboo thing, that on one hand side, when we mind for the story, everything what is most important is the intention, why we actually, when we have found different stories, why we want to share them, what is our intention behind. On the other hand side, exactly this magic moment, this intention can be misunderstood if the story doesn't fit our audience.
Yes. I always tell my leaders that the story is never the end of a conversation. A story is always the beginning of a conversation. And a lot of the leaders I work with, they want to tell a story, kind of like I used to with selling Coca-Cola. Here's the story, go buy Coke. Well, it's a lot of leaders want that. If I tell a story, I can make people do something.
Yeah.
And I say no. It's the beginning of a conversation, because stories are these incredibly efficient containers of data and emotion and assumptions and beliefs and conclusions and mental models, all wrapped up in this powerful, efficient little container called a story. So when we tell a story, the next step is to invite the team in to become interpretive community and say, what did you hear? I'll tell you my intention. Here's why I told the story. What did you hear? What did you notice? Yeah. What did that feel like for you? What do you take from that? What actionable wisdom do you hear from that? Now, what's your story, right? And now the space of meaning making just gets larger and larger.
I love it. I love it, because this is exactly what, again, adds this one more layer to even more magic. That it's not so much about telling the story and just, putting it in the space somewhere out, but also the hope that it generates dialogue, that it triggers curiosity, that it triggers also the need, also the willingness for the others to share their stories and really to learn from one other's experience. Okay, this is just the first step, and you see, this is really.
We need 2 more hours.
We need 2 more hours, definitely, David. So let us have a look at the second one, working with Story Canvas. There are many ideas how to work with Story Canvas, and of course, they have different structures and so on and so forth. Most important thing is, what is, accordingly to you, the most important added value when leaders work with Canvas?
So what Joanna is referring to is, when I work with leaders and when I work with groups, a framework that I use with them is this. It's called the Story Canvas. And it's a visual framework where once you've identified through story mining once you've identified a story that you want to bring to your system or to your team or to your market, now since we're talking about story for influence, we want to tell the story really well so that it lands with impact. And so that's what the story canvas is. We build the story visually on this framework using sticky notes. And you're also welcome to come to my website and download one for free. You can have one. But you build the story visually and then you test telling it to see if it sounds different. The most important part of the canvas, I think, is this last box right here at the end of the process that says, and now we know, or and that's why. And this is where in leadership context, story becomes strategic. And at the end, this is where the leader reveals their intent and says, I think this story says something. There's a reason I brought this story to you. And this is what makes leadership storytelling different from entertainment storytelling. Because in entertainment storytelling, we don't usually do that. Sometimes Aesop's fables have a moral at the end of the story, but most people don't like that very much. So in entertainment, we don't say, here's how to interpret the story. But in leadership, we're not telling stories to entertain, we're telling stories to align and move people forward. So it's very important to say, I think this says something about who we are or what we're doing or why we're doing it. And then you use your language to make that intent overt. So when I work with leaders, that's where we actually spend most of our time, is that intentional piece of the story.
Yeah. Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. It's really very, very interesting to see also how different people work with, different structures, so to say, because of course we are familiar with the hero's journey, the 3 acts. Yeah, we are familiar with different techniques. Of course, you can, I don't know, count them really for hours and hours. Yeah, also including some ideas how to start in general. Yeah, is it in media res? Is it really, yes, just false start, or you name it.
Right,
It's
absolutely.
it's not so much about technique. It's really a lot about really, as you have just emphasized, going through your own story and as the most important part of the process, really allowing this deep self-reflection.
The process of building your story is, it's funny because leaders are always thinking about outcome. Leaders are always thinking about, influence. I'm telling the story because I want something to happen. And you're right. What happens is once they start working with their story and thinking through, what is the story I'm telling? Why am I telling this? You're right. It does become this journey of self-discovery. Now they kind of go inside themselves, and now they're observing their own emotions and they're clarifying their own intent. And when I do work with leaders to tell stories for influence, there's a lot of reasons to tell stories. Influence is one reason.
Yes,
I tell stories because I want to move people forward. It's not the only reason. There's also a story for knowledge sharing. There's story for identity work. There's story for healing and equity and justice. So there are all these different reasons to tell stories. A lot of the time I'm working with leaders for influence. I'm telling stories because there is something that we're trying to make happen. But what happens in that process, they get really focused on, okay, I want people to buy. I want the team to move. I want the organization to change. In the process, they find out that there's a lot more going on. There is healing. There is identity. There is reconnection of all the broken pieces of the organization coming back together when we tell stories to each other. So you're right. It's a very profound inner journey. My customers tell me they get a lot more than they thought they were getting. They thought they were going to learn to tell stories, and they end up having this really powerful internal experience.
Yeah. Your comment brings me to one more question, actually, Because what I hear pretty often is, yes, storytelling, fantastic and really great, and fantastic approach. Some people even say it's a tool. Okay, it's not really a tool. It's really
I don't like
about the
that word
mindset
either.
and the
Yeah.
heart set. Yeah,
It's
but
not a hammer. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. But then also, what I hear pretty often, it's so cool, and as you have just said, so amazing and so time consuming. So how do you actually find arguments for really working with stories and at this really deep level, and allowing this time consuming process, even if leaders also say we are completely run out of time?
Um, that's interesting. It is time consuming, and developing stories, working in stories, spending time in them, and then even telling them. Some people say when I'm in a sales presentation, I want to get to the data as fast as possible, and my story might take 2 minutes to tell, which is a long time. If you're a fast moving salesperson. I don't usually have to make the case that this deserves time. What I do is I bring leaders and teams together and say, let's tell some stories, let's experience it. And then they come to the conclusion, wow, this is powerful. Wow, this is a better way of connecting and engaging with each other. Wow, if we could create this kind of engagement with others in the organization, or with our partners, or with our clients and customers, think how powerful that would be. So it is going slow, but we can go farther together when we tell stories. And I usually don't have to explain that. My clients and my partners come to that conclusion on their own.
Oh, this is great. I want to get to know your clients.
Well,
They seem to bring much more patience.
I don't know. I mean, if you notice the subtitle of the book, story, I mean, it's all about speed, right? I mean, story
Exactly.
dash, find, develop, and activate your most valuable business stories in just a few hours. So
Exactly.
I put that on there because that's what my leaders are saying is, we can't do this for 3 days, but we can do it for a few hours.
Yeah.
So
So you actually accelerate the process, and this is what you promise in your book. And that's why my question with this, time consuming process, because the next step actually after mining for stories, and I'm really grateful for your comment that it's not only about stories for inspiration, but also stories about the value of diversity, equity, stories of identity, and so on and so forth. After filling in the story canvas, and this is of course a very structured process, even if it's very creative, you invite the leaders to have the tell test, so to say.
yeah. So leaders like to complete a task, and so after they fill in this story canvas, they think, great, I'm done. I built my story. I say, no, you're not done, because it's, in the story of Pinocchio, Geppetto created a puppet out of wood, but it wasn't alive yet. We need the blue fairy to come and give life to this creation. And that I tell my leaders, think of this as Pinocchio. We have to breathe life into your story, not through a special spell, simply by telling it to people. And so this is the magical part of the process, where we now sit in a circle and tell the stories that we have strategically identified and developed. But now we're just using our voices. Now we're just talking to each other to tell the stories. And this is where we bring in this ageless, timeless construct for human connection, which is sitting in a circle and telling stories to each other. It's very powerful. It's a lot of fun also. But then we do have that meaning-making conversation where now we're inviting the rest of the team in to say, what did you hear?
Yeah.
And how did you react to that? And if I were to bring this story to a different audience, what would I need to think about? And now, we're making stories better. We're really in a meaning-making conversation. It's knowledge construction and sense-making that we're all doing together before we bring our stories out to the world.
Mm. Yes, because the very last step, what you also emphasize in your process is actually activating the stories. Yeah. So I guess it's very important to really have this let's say time for practicing, fine tuning, and so on and so forth, because before leaders really go onto the stage and bring their whole courage and share their stories.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's what we practice, and it depends on the context. Again, if we are in knowledge sharing, then that's a lot more comfortable. That can just look like us sitting in a circle talking to each other. If we're talking about influence, if I'm
Mhm.
standing on a stage and there's a camera pointing at me and I'm speaking into a microphone, my stories will sound different.
Mm.
I want to be very intentional in the stories. Or if I'm filming stories, or if it's the About Us page on the website, right? We want to be very intentional about the stories that we tell. So those sound different. So depending on the context, we'll practice telling the stories in different kinds of ways. One thing I always hear from leaders is they say things like, I don't want to sound like I'm performing. The word
Yeah.
storytelling has that feeling of a performance.
Yeah.
And I
Mm.
say, yeah, I don't want to sound that way either.
Mhm.
And this isn't about a performance. When you do this right, you don't sound like you're reciting a script that you've written. You'll just sound like you
Yeah.
talking about things you care about,
Yeah.
right? So it's not about a performance. It's about using your natural voice. I even tell people I don't do public speaking skills training. I'm not going to teach you to be a better public speaker.
Mm.
I am going to help you find some narrative assets, some value holding stories that say something really important about the things that you care about, and then you get to deliver those to your world in your own voice.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. When I hear also, especially your very last sentence, it's really about giving the voice to the leader so that they really bring the message their way. Yeah, it brings me to the ABC of storytelling, so to say. That was actually the result of a conversation with a very, very dear friend of mine before one of the presentations about storytelling. And I was really completely lost, and she said, "Why are you so lost? You know what you are talking about. Hey, you need to just grab the stuff that is in front of your mind, so to say, or on your mind, sorry, and just put it in three words. What are the three words that are important with storytelling for people who share stories?" And I say, okay, it's an ABC. A for authenticity, so exactly this what you have just emphasized. B for building relationship, so we
Mm.
don't tell the stories for ourselves, we do it in the process, but later on we have to give the stories to the others so that they can work with them. They are not our stories any longer in the way we see them and we interpret them, but also how other people interpret them,
Mm.
and we need to live with this. Yeah. And also the courage, so the courage, the C of
Ah,
storytelling, that is important, just to show up with our own story. Yeah.
authenticity, building, and courage. Is that the ABC?
Yeah. Building relationships. Yeah.
Relationship. Love it. So I will use that, and when I tell that, I'll say, I have a wonderful friend in Hanover named Joanna Sell, and she taught me something really. She calls it the ABCs of storytelling. So I love it. That's
Yes, I wrote it in a book, Beyond Storytelling. So, so it's also somewhere in the virtual space in one of the chapters in one of the billions of books.
good.
Anyway, when we work with stories, I'm really, really curious to also hear from you, not only how you work with stories with leaders, with other people, but also how you work with stories with yourself, so to say. And with this, I'm sure the tradition of One Word Stories series is the next question coming, what was actually the one word that was supportive for you during this troubling time, during Corona times or COVID pandemics? And what is the story behind?
Hmm. Okay. The word is vision. And I remember after coronavirus, after COVID hit, around March of 2020, March, April, that's when all of my clients started calling, because my work, I travel a lot. I go to organizations. Everybody called me and said, we're canceling the contract. I mean, just my phone was ringing, cancel, cancel, cancel. All of my income went away. All of my clients, I lost all of my clients. I couldn't get my money back from my airfare. I had like 20,000 US dollars that I could not get back from the airline in flights that I had booked, all canceled. And I remember sitting in the backyard. This is my house, just sitting in the backyard with my wife, Robbie, and we were watching the sun go down, and the bats were coming out. So there were bats flying over our heads as we watched the sun go down. And I remember saying to Robbie, I feel stuck. And I said, I can't see what's next. And that was a scary feeling for me, because I'm always somebody who has an idea of what I'm going to do next. And I'd never really felt that paralyzed before, where I thought, I don't know how to do my work in this world. I don't know how to get clients. I don't know how to turn this around. And I remember being scared, sitting in the backyard. And then it was the next morning when I came into my office, there was an email from an editor at a publishing company. This is one of those magic moments where he said, I think you've got another book you're ready to write. And I said, I think so too. Right. So vision. I remember, here in the United States, back in the year 2008, we had a huge financial crisis, driven by the housing market. But the same thing happened in 2008. I lost a lot of my business. And I remember the same anxious feeling of, oh no, how am I going to make money? And I started creating products during that time. So what I like, there are things I don't like about myself. One thing I do like about myself is when I get anxious or when I feel stuck, I use that time to create. And, anxious systems aren't creative. Anxiety kills creativity. So maybe for me, it's almost like an act of rebellion to being stuck, to say, I'm going to make something. And so that's why vision becomes the most important thing for me at times when I'm totally stuck.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Very powerful.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, and very inspiring. I'm really grateful for your comment that, especially, this disruptive times that are supposed to kill creativity can be really used for the creative processes, just because at one point we see that everything that used to work doesn't work anymore the way we are used to it. And we can try out, or even should try out, different things, and it involves creativity, of course. So very inspiring words. Thank you. Thank you very, very much, David. Thank you for your time, for your energy, for all your fantastic stories. And of course, for, the invitation to dive deeper into your story dash. Actually, the whole process has been a part of our conversation.
And I am so grateful for your voice and the work that you're doing, and the way you advocate for equity and power distribution. That voice must never be lost in the work around story. A lot of people are trying to use story as a tool, like you say, and that's why your voice is so important, to keep that humanity in the conversation. So thank you for what you're doing, Joanna.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And see you in Frankfurt, Munich, Berlin. We will see.
Very good.
Take care.